conference on international security. So he actually chose to make the speech in Munich with Chancellor Merkel, you know, sharing the platform with him. But I don't think it was some kind of collaboration or conspiracy. But what was the trigger? It wasn't the first time that these politicians or their equivalents, earlier equivalents, have said multiculturalism is dead. I mean, if one was to, no doubt, you know, do a Google search here and other forms of literature search, if one was to count the number of times it's been said that multiculturalism is dead, I mean, the very fact that they need to keep saying it every other year is in itself indicative that they got it wrong, that it's not dead. So there wasn't an immediate trigger, but I think it's very clear, I think that everybody will agree, that if we take the backlash over a decade as opposed to just those speeches, it is very strongly linked to a fear of Muslims. And this is partly to do with kind of 9/11 and international terrorism and the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. But it's not just that. And in fact, you know, it predates it. A lot of it is seeing Muslims as a cultural threat. Someone did an analysis of British papers over a certain period of time, over the last few years, the period of time was over the last few years, and they looked at what was said about Muslims and how often and so on. It was so negative. I mean, like, it was like 95% of the times Muslims were mentioned in the national print, it was for a negative reason. But, you know, they wanted to analyze what these reasons were and typologize them. And what they found was that unless there was a specific terrorist incident, either in Europe or abroad, you know, like in Baghdad or something, unless there was something very specific that had put terrorism on the news, let us say within the last month, including trials in Britain, so not just terrorist incidents, sorry, but also bringing to court people with charges of terrorism, because then obviously the newspapers report on that. Unless that was the case, which it often was, the majority of the articles which mentioned Muslims and spoke of Muslims in a negative way were to do with cultural issues, to do with dress, like the burqa or the hijab, to do with halal meat, to do with alleged demands of Sharia. Muslims wanted Sharia and this was unacceptable, and so on. There's a whole list of things. So I don't know about the immediate trigger, if there was one, and there may not have been. It could have been just, you know, the rise, the movement towards more right-wing parties, right-wing governments as a result of elections. So that may have been just a coincidence that elections took place and more right-wing premiers were dominating European capitals. But clearly, if we step back and see it over a decade, it's very much linked to a fear of Muslims, or what we call Islamophobia.
One thing, one very quick, Michelle.
I'm a geographer and I do research on everyday multiculturalism. So my question is that just in terms of Muslims, you were just talking about attitudes towards Muslims, don't you think that change takes place through everyday life, just through everyday intercultural encounters? And those do get scaled up because they challenge, you know, views of national identity, like particularly for Australian national identity, privileges whiteness and Anglo-ness. So from that point of view, I think it does get scaled up and it does have some sort of impact. And also just in terms of ethical visions of citizenship, you were talking about ethical visions of citizenship, and I think just in terms of responsibility and those qualities, I wouldn't say it's sort of just concentrated in a local area or in a city. It's much more than that. So just in terms of everyday multiculturalism, I just want to know your view, and you know, because you're quite strong about
yes,
that.
Yes, I'm quite strong. The way you put it, that it gets scaled up. Well, of course, I said that I was in favour of looking at different scales where they are shown to be interdependent or certainly in a relationship to each other, including transnational. So I'm quite, you know, supportive of studies that say if you want to understand, let's say, Pakistanis in Britain, you also need to understand their relationship with families and events in Pakistan and so The geographers that I'm less happy with are those who have a critique of the national, which tends to be a normative critique on the basis of, as it were, research, which let's say is good research, good social science focused on the local, but a normative critique of the national. And that seems to me just not intellectually coherent. You know, if they have a critique of the national, let's hear it directly, because it's not based on research. The research shows the relationships, or your way of putting it, scaled up. So if they showed if they showed something like, well, we did a study in Birmingham, and do you know what? Nobody ever talked about being British or anything, but they talked about being proud to be Brummies and things like this. Well, what's the scaling up of that? How they interpret it, the kinds of people I'm critical of, how they interpret it is, oh, it shows that national identity plays no part in the life of people in Birmingham because they're more focused on what it is to be Brummie, to support the local team, or you know. So, no, that doesn't follow at all. If you look under a microscope and you don't see anything outside, you can't draw as a conclusion of that study, oh, there was nothing outside what I saw in my microscope.
One last question.
Yeah, I've got two parts there, if that's okay. I was interested in what you said about multiculturalism and the backlash against it not affecting existing minorities within the European or British context.
Especially British.
Or saying again, within the British context. Because I was thinking, in response, I don't know if you, I was alive to get basis, so apologies for that, but the whole notion of racism, and particularly institutionalised racism, I think that fits in with that kind of debate. Because, you know, what's very happy with in the British context, in terms of post-Steve violence and so on, is that even though there's a debate going on there about the backlash was culture affecting new arrivals, there's still an effect, there's still a negative effect on existing minorities in particular ways as well. So just wanted to on that. And the second part really is about the future. I mean, I'm interested, you know, in just come out recently, but you know, where do we go from here? Is my kind of query. I mean, I think like most academics have an anti-essentialist kind of viewpoint as well, but we do need to act. So I just picked up a point that the gentleman made here about culture. I think it's a really important way of testing the temperature about what's actually happening on the ground from a number of different levels. And so I would say that all the different approaches, whether it's from top-down elites, political elites, as well as those bottom-up in terms of however we look at from what's happening in the everyday culture, there should be ways in which we can tease out ways forward. And I just wanted to know a little bit more about what you said. So there are two.
Right, well, I straight away agree with the end part of what you say. Yes, I'm very concerned about that we should be thinking about the way forward. And in a way, that's why I'm quite heavy on things like interculturalism, because I think they are not offering us a way forward, even though that's what they say they're doing, and that's why I want to engage with them. I also agree with the penultimate part of what you said, which is how different kinds of studies, you said, can help us tease things out, like the way forward, but in fact they can help us tease out other things as well. And so I agree with that kind of complementarity, not either or, but both and, or you know, multiply and so on. All these things help us to understand the phenomenon that we're interested in better. So so that's the agreement. About the first part, about perhaps I was a little bit too loose in my phrasing when I said that they don't have a major impact on existing ethnic minorities in, say, Britain. I mean, in one way, rhetoric itself has a very big effect. So I was actually at that point talking about policies, what kind of policies changes have happened. I think, obviously, given what I just said 2 minutes ago about Muslims and Islamophobia, I think that's had a very big effect. And I think that, so you mentioned the Lawrence Inquiry, and it's obviously very good that we now have convictions. putting it very simply and using a metaphor that is sometimes used, that when it comes to things like, you know, the conviction of the murderers of Stephen Lawrence, and I'm just assuming enough people understand the reference here, one can either say, we're making progress, or we can say, we're not, because he was murdered and it's taken, you know, 13 years or whatever it is to get these convictions. So we can either say that the glass is half full or the glass is half empty. I'm more of the half full end. I think the fact that the Metropolitan Police carried on with that inquiry, I mean, and they devoted an enormous amount of resources to it, shows some kind of commitment. Though, of course, there was also a lot of political pressure, but the political pressure itself is important. The fact that the Met thought there was political pressure in order to pursue a racist murder, that's important. But on the other hand, I understand those people who might say, well, the fact that it's taken the Metropolitan Police 13 years, and the fact that there were so many mistakes in the first place, you know, we can't overlook that. And certainly there have been articles in the British press, including from either serving police men and women, especially in London, or who recently were in the Metropolitan Police but have left it, saying they still thought that it was institutionally racist. So, but I think, but on the other hand, I want to say there's lots of other people who both pointing to evidence but also lived experience, like David Lammy, who's an MP for Tottenham, exactly the kinds of place that issues about the police treatment of young black men has been a very hot issue. He says local people believe that the relationship between the black community and the police has been transformed in recent decades. And he said that, you know, after the Duggan, the death of Duggan, and after all those riots and so on. Now, I'm not saying he's right. All I'm saying is that we have a mixture of aired views by people who you know, may know something. So perhaps, you know, half full or half empty.
All right, on that half full, half empty note, we'll thank